Greetings from Boston. My name is Aaron Knapp. Welcome to Tennis Talk Daily. We have two items on the agenda today. First, the Barcelona Open has begun, and I want to talk about the draw and some of the possible matchups that we could see later in the week. Second, I want to revisit a topic that I raised in my last few videos with respect to the one-handed backhand, the significance of the shot, the history of the shot, and the future of the shot, and the implications for the game that the shot presents. In particular, as I've said, this is an obsolescent shot at this point. It's going extinct, and I believe that is a very, very problematic trend. I believe very strongly that we need to preserve the one-hander. It is an absolute, essential, imperative goal of this channel and of mine. In terms of how we can do that, we can talk about how, but we're fans, so we've got to support the one-handers if we want the one-hander to be preserved. But I want to talk about the history, how we got here, and what we should do going into the future and why with respect to the one-hander. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get the essential commentary. I love your comments. I love the comments from the people that disagree with me. I learn so much from the people who disagree with me. In fact, I think it's been said that you really can't learn anything from someone who agrees with you. So the more people that disagree with me, the better, because the more I learn about myself, about my own positions, and about tennis, and about your positions as well. So subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and let's address the Barcelona Open. Let's talk about the history of the one-handed backhand. Let's talk tennis. Well, if Kei Nishikori was a little disappointed with his performance in the final at Monte Carlo against Rafael Nadal, he might have an opportunity to redeem himself very soon. Rafa and Nishikori could be facing each other again within a few days in the round of 16 at Barcelona. I'm looking forward to that potential match because I think Nishikori can do a lot more damage to Nadal than he did last Sunday. If he gets through, which he probably will, Rafa could face none other than Novak Djokovic in the quarterfinal at Barcelona. That will be interesting because, of course, Novak Djokovic has not only found better form recently, but has demonstrated in the past an ability to get the better of Rafael Nadal on clay. So we'll be anxiously anticipating that quarterfinal as well. A test for Djokovic, to be sure, if he gets that far. If Djokovic doesn't get that far, we might see Feliciano Lopez in the quarterfinal against Rafa, their countryman. And Feliciano brings a totally different kind of game based around that one-handed backhand, and it would be an interesting matchup in that regard. If Rafa gets through to the semifinal, which he probably will, he may face David Goffin, he may face Leonardo Mayer, Karen Khachanov, or most probably Hyun Chung. In the bottom half of the draw, we have a few of our favorites, a few of our warriors. Dominic Thiem, Grigor Dimitrov. Thiem could face Diego Schwartzman in the quarterfinal, or the one-hander Tsitsipas, or most probably Ramos Vinolas. Dimitrov will probably face Carreño Busta in the last quarterfinal, and that will tee up a semifinal possibly between Thiem and Dimitrov, which would be interesting. We've seen a lot of Dimitrov versus Goffin recently, but I can't remember the last time we saw a Thiem versus Dimitrov in terms of that particular lost generation matchup. Well, that will be interesting. Again, the two one-handers, the two Federer warriors. That, of course, will tee up a potential final between Rafael Nadal and either Dominic Thiem or Grigor Dimitrov, in which case Either Thiem or Dimitrov will have the opportunity to redeem after sort of disappointing performances in Monte Carlo against the King of Clay. So stay tuned for developments at Barcelona. We'll have a lot more on that later in the week as the tournament heats up. Let's talk about the one-hander. Let's talk about the history of this very beautiful shot. I think it's the most beautiful shot in tennis. It's the greatest shot in tennis, if you ask me. But in the beginning, God made the one-hander. In the beginning, God made the one-hander. The history suggests that the one-handed backhand was the most natural way for people to hit their backhands. Everybody did it. No one thought twice about it. Think about it in this way. A baseball player holds the bat with two hands, bats in a way that would be a forehand for a tennis player, right? And a golfer takes the golf club in the same way, right? You take the two hands. Now, that's a sort of natural thing to do. A two-handed forehand, hard as it is to believe, is kind of a natural shot. Pancho Segura, who was Jimmy Connor's coach, but also a very talented tennis player, hit a double-handed forehand and a single-handed backhand. But a double-handed forehand is more natural than a double-handed backhand. The backhand is just all wrong. So that's part of the reason why the two-hander is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's not a natural shot, or it didn't feel natural for generation after generation after generation after generation. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, and at mid-century, you had people like Rod Laver, of course, in the 60s, popularizing the one-hander. Don Budge, who is one of the all-time great tennis players, the first men's tennis player to win a calendar slam in 1938. He also holds the record for consecutive Grand Slams won. He won 6 consecutive Grand Slams in that 1938, I believe 1937 period. And the Bleacher Report ranks the Budge backhand as the greatest backhand in the history of the sport. Well, Budge hit a one-hander, and he was an innovator to some extent because until Budge, there was a lot of slicing, to be honest, on the backhand. It was considered the inherently weaker shot in a way. And Budge made it into a weapon. He started hitting the ball flat with a little top spin and started hitting some kind of penetrating backhands and using it as a weapon. The next key person other than Laver was Ken Rosewall, who had a very, very effective slice. I mean, he was actually all about slicing, but he varied it up with his slicing, and it could be a very offensive shot for him as well. So by the 1960s, again, the one-hander is just the predominant stroke. It's the natural stroke. You have developments that are making it into a more assertive weapon. But in the 60s, it begins to change. Cliff Drysdale, who went on to become a famous tennis commentator, was also one of the first, I think the first successful tennis player to employ a two-handed backhand. And in his case, it was a stronger shot than his forehand. So that was kind of something new that people were a little bit puzzled about. Drysdale came along, his backhand was better than his forehand. He was hitting it with two hands. He defeated Rod Laver in 1968, right before Laver went on to win his second calendar slam. At the U.S. Open, he defeated Laver. And why? Well, it was because of that two-handed backhand and because of the returns of service that were possible with the two-hander without that backswing, those blocking sort of returns that can be very effective. Of course, Agassi and Djokovic would later perfect that shot, but that was part of why Drysdale was able to get the better of Laver on that occasion at the U.S. Open. Bjorn Borg was another person who popularized the two-hand, and he started putting even more topspin on it than Budge did, and really that anybody else had. So that was the real innovation for Borg. And listen, it started with Connors, Borg, On the women's side, there was Chris Evert. The two-hander really started to get popular. By the 1990s, the one-hander was in the minority. Now, you did have Lendl, McEnroe, Becker, and Edberg, but again, by the 90s, the two-hander was on the rise and the one-hander was becoming the minority. Well, then we have Pete Sampras and the Sampras moment. Pete Sampras made a very critical decision as a teenager at the behest of his coach, Peter Fischer. He changed from a two-handed backhand, which was the popular way to go at that point, certainly the easier backhand to hit. He changed from the two-hander to the one-hander, and he made some sacrifices to do so. The purpose was to win Wimbledon. He wanted to be able to charge the net more effectively. Peter Fischer and Pete Sampras decided that they were going to need a one-handed backhand for purposes of winning Wimbledon. Of course, the rest is history. It really did work. But the important point is this. Sampras had to make sacrifices. He had to go backwards. He had to take steps back in order to learn this new stroke. And he lost a lot. And it was a hard path, a hard road, but eventually he did perfect it, and he became one of the all-time greats, and one of the all-time greats certainly at Wimbledon in particular. So Sampras was a force, an important force for the preservation of the one-handers. So was Stefan Edberg, who had an amazing, tremendous return of serve with his one-handed backhands. But nevertheless, the two-hander was on the rise for a number of reasons. Particularly, I mean, you did have Andre Agassi. You did have Jim Courier, a number of other two-handers that were doing well, experiencing success in the 1990s. Well, at the turn of the century, after 2001, the courts start to slow down. At the same time, the racket technology is changing, and the two-hander becomes a more viable shot. It becomes even easier to hit the two-hander with the bigger racket heads, and certainly with the lighter rackets, but also the slower courts necessitate the dependability that players were finding in the two-handed backhand. Again, the baseline play really relies on consistency, right? It's all about not making errors. Well, I think the conventional wisdom crystallized in the 90s and going into the 21st century that the two-hander was just a more consistent shot, and it would behoove, therefore, players to learn that shot in order to excel from the baseline, which is what was happening as the courts became slower and slower. Of course, there were exceptions. There was Roger Federer, there was Justine Henin, and there were a few others, but generally the trend has been away from the one-hander. Well, there's a number of reasons for that. I've kind of talked about it, but what I will say is this. The advantages that people tend to give to the two-hander are actually not really advantages in the end. The one advantage that you could probably argue that the two-hander has would be on the return of serve, when you don't have time to set up the shot. The serve's coming at you just too fast, and you don't have time to set it up, and you don't have time to kind of backswing. The two-hander can come in very handy as a kind of block, but the blocks can be very aggressive and very offensive. I mean, just think of Agassi, think of Djokovic, think of Nadal even in some instances. Well, they can be very useful with respect to returning serve, and you have to believe that the increasing predominance of the two-hander led to the lesser predominance of the big servers. Again, the big servers, the servers and volleyers tended to be selected out in this process. In the end, To my mind, the one-hander is actually the superior shot. What it comes down to is this. It's a harder shot. It's a harder shot to master. That's really the only difference. There's no real disadvantage to the one-handed backhand. With the increasing abilities of the players to put the topspin, this has to do with the larger racket heads too, but the topspin backhands have enabled the one-handers to get balls that are bouncing higher on the clay surfaces, for example, and has been something that has, again, kind of neutralized any difference between the one-hander and two-hander in connection with returning serve. I do give the two-hander just a little bit of an advantage on returning serve and really returning serve only, but there are so many benefits, so many advantages that the one-hander offers that I think ultimately, the one-hander is the better shot, but also that at the very least it must be preserved. So what does the one-hander offer? Greater reach, particularly for the running shots. Much greater reach at the net as well. An ability to get the low balls and to put tremendous pace and penetration on returns from low bouncing balls. And when you set the shot up correctly and you hit it correctly, the one-hander generates more power than you can with the two-hander. That has to do with the sort of spring-like mechanism you can bring into the backhands when you're using one hand only. Though the wind-up can take a little longer, you have the potential to generate a lot more power. Of course, the one-hander tends to encourage better net play, encourages an all-court game, forward momentum, certainly creates better volleyers. There's also the variety that the one-hander offers, the different varieties of slices, topspin, flat shots, also the flicks, which are very unique to the one-hander. Typically, the people with two-handers cannot do the flicks very well. They struggle with the flicks. There is a version of a flick in the two-handed mode, but it doesn't work very well. And certainly at the net, again, putting away shots, the one-hander has a lot more potential penetration. You also have the options for disguise drop shots and all sorts of angles that are not really achievable with the two-hander. And then finally, it has superior beauty. It is a beautiful shot. It is the most beautiful shot in tennis. I firmly believe that. So it is so important to preserve this shot, at least as part of the variety. I'm not saying we should do away with the two-hander completely. I'm saying that as part of the mix, we need more one-handed backhands in the game. And what we really need to do is encourage up-and-coming tennis players to tackle the problem, which is do the work that needs to be done to develop the one-handed backhand. It's a harder shot to master. Remember the Sampras moment. The Sampras moment, the Sampras decision paid off. It really did, but he was set back. He had to make sacrifices. He did lose a lot after he switched over. It was hard for him, but he ended up really following through on that decision and becoming a much, much better player, better all-court player, and a better player for a number of other reasons due directly to that change, that decision. So young players need to make that decision, commit to it, and learn the harder shot. It's not a shot that puts you at a disadvantage, folks. That's a myth. It's simply a harder shot. There are only advantages to the one-handed backhand. So it's all upside. It's all upside. The only downside is it requires more work. It requires more work. It requires more practice. And ultimately, it requires more talent. But in the end, it is a superior shot. There's nothing that the two-hander offers that the one-hander cannot produce. Federer has carried on a one-handed legacy that preceded him. It's not all about Federer here. There's a line of players that goes back, and Federer represents that tradition. And so in preserving the one-handed legacy, we preserve Federer's legacy, but we preserve an entire historical tradition in tennis. And it's a tradition that, while it's a shot that's harder to master, it offers tremendous advantages. It is, I will say once again, the greatest, when mastered, it is the greatest and most beautiful shot in tennis. So we have to preserve the one-handed backhand. That is a mission that I really believe in. So let's have a discussion about this. If you disagree, I think it's hard to disagree with the proposition that we need to have more one-handers in the mix, at the very least. 3 one-handers in the top 20 is not right. It's too few. It's encouraging a homogeneity in the game and the style of play that is wrong. So we need to put tennis back on a better course that has heterogeneity, that has different styles of play, and that has great single-handed backhands, because, you know, the shot has not been exhausted in terms of the possibilities it presents. Nobody's working on it anymore. Nobody's trying to develop it. Well, if we start paying attention to it, if we start trying to develop it, if the younger players and the coaches start going back and say, let's do what Sampras did. Let's switch. Let's switch. It's going to take some work. You're going to have to make some sacrifices. You're going to become a worse player for a while. You're going to lose, but it's going to pay off. The possibilities are not yet fully explored with the one-hander, and they're really not being explored anymore because nobody's hitting them anymore virtually. So, on the other hand, it is the backhand of champions, folks. It is the backhand of the greatest tennis player of all time. And there is this tradition of the greatest players of all time hitting the one-handed backhand. It's a difficult shot. It requires talent, but it's worth the work. Let's talk about this, an interesting topic. Let's save the one-hander. I will look forward to speaking with you soon. Give me your comments. Let's have a discussion. Be well. Bye-bye.